Welcome to this week's episode of Insights. During this week's show, we're going to be discussing the possible but yet not confirmed meeting on November 9th between the representatives of Armenia, of the Russian Federation, and of the Aliyev regime in regards to the two issues of border demarcation and about opening up the regional transportation systems. During this show, we will focus on the on the many pitfalls or risks that are involved in this process and the few possible positives that might come out of it. Let's look at this universally. I think the fact that this meeting is between these three countries and not through the OSCE format is not a positive. It is much better for this to be part of the traditional OSCE format rather than just these three countries. But it is very clear that this driving force behind this is the Russian Federation and its leader, Vladimir Putin. One of the things that Putin said was that, of course, this meeting is going to involve Russia because we are the only ones, essentially the Russian General Staff, that has all of the maps of the Soviet borders. So you cannot really have any kind of a border reconciliation without our involvement. What is likely the Russian driving force, motivation in this is two things. One, to control all of these transportation systems, because if you do, you essentially have a say in multiple countries, whether it's Artsakh, whether it's Armenia, whether it's Azerbaijan, and most importantly, it gives the Russians the ability to further marginalize the Georgian state and its dominance in the transportation corridors of this region. Let's start off with the first of these 2 points, which is the border demarcation issue. Again, I think we need to be clear about this. In and of itself, border demarcation is not a bad thing. It is something that eventually needs to happen. But there are a lot of X factors and pitfalls that we need to watch out for. First of all, when we're talking about borders, which ones are we discussing? Because there are the state borders or the republic borders, what was between the Soviet republics of Armenia and Azerbaijan in the 1920s, and the one in 1991. And part of the problem here is that the 1991 borders, when the Soviet Union fell apart, were far more problematic and favorable to the Armenian side than the 1920s borders. And the reason for this is during the almost 80 years of Soviet rule, there was a systematic theft of Armenian territory by the political system in Baku within the context of the Soviet Union. For example, a perfect example of this is if you look at the 1926 map, there's actually a complete land connection between Armenia and Artsakh, which is essentially the Berdzor area or the Lachin area, which over time became isolated and essentially made Artsakh into an island inside of the Azeri Republic. So when we're talking about borders, we need to be clear about which borders we're talking about, the favorable ones or the unfavorable ones. My guess is that given the fact that the more recent ones are the ones that are somewhat the norm or established internationally or observed internationally in other places, we're going to get the worst end of any of these discussions on that front. Now let's talk about the enclaves issue. Many people are unaware, but there are multiple enclaves that existed between the Soviet, Armenian, and Azeri republics, in which there were Armenian enclaves inside of Azerbaijan and Azeri enclaves inside of Armenia. There's frankly no good reason for any of these things to exist. They're exceptionally problematic, and we should not be in any format for their restoration, because even though geographically they're almost equivalent, the Azeri enclaves that existed during Soviet times are essentially cutting through our transportation corridors internally. So I think as a matter of principle, we should oppose all of any discussions on the enclaves. Secondly, when the current Azeri government was established, they considered themselves the heir to the original First Republic of Azerbaijan. All of these enclaves were established in the Soviet period. So technically, even from a legal perspective, they have absolutely no claim to any of these enclaves. And I think it is it would be well served on everyone's part, and frankly, in the interest of peace and practicality, for these enclaves to be traded and not to be discussed. The key thing on the border demarcation issue, with sort of the 800-pound gorilla, is the issue of Artsakh, because the Azeri side is going to make any final demarcation of the border as some kind of an Armenian capitulation on the recognition of Artsakh, because if you're demarking your border, you're essentially saying Artsakh is behind those borders, and it is not an independent Armenian state. It is actually a part of Azerbaijan. Now, I think semantically there's many, or politically and diplomatically, there's many ways to actually make that clear, that demarking borders does not give and is not a final settlement of any kind to the situation of Artsakh, or the recognition of Artsakh as anything but an independent enclave inside of Azerbaijan and not part of the regime or the system that the regions controlled by the Aliyev regime. If this can be achieved, I think border demarcation is something that is favorable for us. And obviously, any border demarcation must include the immediate and full withdrawal of all of Aliyev's forces from areas of Armenia itself that it has occupied over the last year. The second part of focus of these possible discussions is going to be on the transportation issue. This would be a follow-up to meetings and understandings that were reached right after the war in Moscow between the representatives of the Russian Federation, Armenia, and the Aliyev regime. We must stress again, opening up any and all transportation systems via Armenia, via Azerbaijan, via Iran, via Russia are all very good things. In fact, they are better for us than they are for the Azeri side. For one specific reason is because the Aliyev regime has far more options, transportation options, than we do. So opening up these systems are actually more favorable to our side than not. And by the way, this is likely the reason that Aliyev has been trying to destabilize the situation, the border situations, and other kind of, essentially making any kind of a normalcy difficult, is because he knows that the current setup in which we don't have access to Iran by rail or access to Russia by rail is actually favorable to his side and is not favorable to us. So the more problems he causes, the less likely it is for these transportation systems to reopen. The 800-pound gorilla in this case, on the transportation side, involves what happened in Sunik. As we know, the Azeri dictator has threatened war in order to create an enclave or some kind of a corridor that they control via Sunik that will connect the two parts of the Aliyev-controlled territories, Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan proper. What should our position be on this matter? One, opening up the rail links, connecting our rail links with Iran and with Russia via Azerbaijan, via Azerbaijani territory, while allowing connections between Nakhchivan and the rest of Azerbaijan, is something, it's a concession that we should be very glad to make, because that's a tremendous payoff for us and of minimal significance for the other side. What we cannot, under any scenario, allow is any kind of a corridor through Sunik that will be controlled by the Aliyev regime. In fact, I can say that any government in Yerevan that agrees to anything like that will not last more than a few days. So I think that is a non-starter. However, there are modalities where this issue can be dealt with. For example, there's the Kaliningrad model, in which there's an enclave of Russia that's isolated past Lithuania and the Baltic states, and there's actually a road through Russia, through Lithuania, which essentially connects Kaliningrad with the rest of Russia, and it's actually worked successfully. Now, if we were to create any kind of a scenario like this in Sunik, this would only be acceptable if we have the same exact thing connecting Armenia proper with Artsakh. Otherwise, this is a non-starter. Let's close with what What has been the issue and the problem here? There's been a lot of discussion and misunderstandings and lack of clarity on these issues. And part of it is because our state sector is so poor in communicating anything. There is a lot of mystery. No one knows if these meetings are happening, not happening, what's been discussed so far. And a complete lack of communication on the side of the MFA or the government or the Prime Minister in explaining what these negotiations are. Now, obviously, when you're dealing with negotiations on matters like this, you're not going to be publicly outing every little back and forth. That's not how negotiations are constructed on an international level. However, we are a democratic state. It is very important for the state to make clear what its red lines are and what it is trying to achieve via these negotiations. This is the primary difference between our side and the other side. Aliyev does not need to explain anything. He is the state and he owns his country. We are different, and our state has to do a much better job of telling us what these negotiations are for, what it's trying to achieve, and what it will not accept. Thank you for joining us at this week's episode of Insights.